High in the sandstone cliffs of the American Southwest, hidden in the quiet shadows of ancient stone rooms, lies a secret few people have ever paused to consider. We admire the astonishing cliff dwellings of the Anasazi, the Ancestral Puebloans. We talk about their architecture, their farming, their pottery, their skywatching, but almost no one asks a simple human question that every one of them dealt with every single day. Where did they go to the toilet? It sounds strange, almost inappropriate, yet it opens a door to their real lives in a way grand history never can. If you lived in a stone village carved into a vertical cliff with hundreds of people and no plumbing at all, where would you go? Down the ladder, behind a wall, or right at the cliff's edge? Imagine waking up in a place like Mesa Verde 1,000 years ago. The first light of day has not reached the canyon floor yet, and a cool wind moves through the narrow cracks in the rock. Families stir inside their stone rooms. Fires are lit. Corn is ground. Children play among the shadows of the dwellings. These cliff cities look peaceful today, but back then they were full of life. People talking, working, climbing, cooking. Dozens of families lived side by side on a ledge not much deeper than a living room. They slept there, cooked there, stored food, held ceremonies, and shared every inch of space. But there is one detail we never see in museum models or school diagrams. Every man, woman, and child in these rooms needed to relieve themselves. Some once a day, some more often. Life does not stop for architecture. So how did they handle it? What archaeologists have found is both practical and surprisingly revealing. The Anasazi did not build bathrooms or designated latrines. There were no small structures tucked away behind the houses, no organized sanitation facilities. Instead, the evidence shows they adapted their bathroom habits to their environment in ways that are surprisingly logical. One of the biggest clues comes from something most people never want to think about: coprolites, fossilized human waste. These tiny pieces of dried material have been found in caves, middens, and open areas near ancient settlements. They show that people often relieve themselves outside of the living areas, choosing locations away from food, family, and ceremony. They did not bury their waste neatly like some cultures, but they did not leave it next to their homes either. This tells us the Anasazi understood hygiene on a practical level long before modern sanitation. But this simple explanation becomes far more interesting when we look at the cliff dwellings. There is no outside without climbing, sometimes dangerously. Narrow walkways, sheer drops, and multi-story stone structures meant that leaving the village to find privacy was not always possible. And so another pattern emerges. Archaeologists have found small traces of human waste tucked into cracks behind walls, hidden in natural rock gaps, or collected in corners that were rarely used. These were not large communal piles. They were personal spots, the kind of private corners someone might use quickly, quietly, and without drawing attention. It is not glamorous, but it makes sense in a densely packed stone village where privacy was nearly impossible. People did what they had to do and found their own solutions. Then there is the cliff edge. In several cliff dwellings, researchers found increased organic traces near certain ledges, suggesting that some people simply squatted near the edge and let gravity take care of the rest. Shocking at first, maybe even amusing, but also practical. When you're 20 meters above the canyon floor, when there's nothing below you except the wind and the rock, it suddenly becomes a very simple solution. No cleanup, no smell, no contamination of the living area. Just nature doing what nature does. But what about the great cities like Chaco Canyon? These were not cramped cliff dwellings, but sprawling urban centers with plazas, workshops, storage rooms, and ceremonial structures. Here, the Anasazi had space to organize their waste differently. In Chaco Canyon, archaeologists found large trash dumps, called middens, used for everything: broken pottery, bones, ashes, food scraps, and yes, human waste. These areas were located slightly away from the homes, but close enough to be used daily. In these pits, Coprolites revealed diets filled with maize, seeds, meat, and occasionally evidence of parasites and illness. There were no official latrines, but there were clearly recognized dumping zones. This was an early form of sanitation, simple yet effective. Keep the waste away from where people eat, sleep, and pray. What's fascinating is how flexible the system was. In cliff dwellings, people used corners, cracks, and ledges. In flat settlements, they used open dumping areas. In smaller villages, they likely used natural spots outside the homes, just far enough to avoid contamination, but close enough to reach safely. The Anasazi did not rely on a single method. They adapted their solutions to the landscape, the architecture, and the daily realities of surviving in the desert. And yet, this isn't just a story about ancient toilets. It's a story about understanding the people behind the ruins. It shows us they were practical thinkers. They protected their food storage areas. They kept ceremonial spaces clean. They avoided polluting water sources. They understood, on an instinctive level, how waste could affect health and community life. For a civilization 1,000 years old, without metal tools, pipes, or engineering manuals, this level of sanitation is remarkable. It also reminds us of something more human. These cliff dwellings, these stone palaces, weren't silent museums. They were homes. People laughed there, lived there, slept, argued, cooked, raised children, mourned, celebrated, and yes, used the bathroom. We often imagine ancient people as distant or purely symbolic, almost mythological. But they weren't. They faced the same basic challenges we do, just in different environments and with different tools. And that's the beauty of this question. It seems silly at first, almost childish, but when you really explore it, you find yourself stepping directly into the daily life of a 1,000-year-old community. History becomes personal, real, tangible. When you think about where the Anasazi went to the toilet, you suddenly imagine walking the same narrow paths, standing on the same ledges, making the same quick decision about privacy, safety, and survival. So next time you see a photograph of Mesa Verde's cliff palace or balcony house, look closely at those tiny shadows between walls. Look at the narrow cracks between structures. Look at the ledges that drop off into the canyon. Somewhere in those cracks and ledges is a small piece of the real human story, one that most people never think about, but one that every member of that ancient community lived through every day. And it leads to one final question. If you lived in a stone village perched high in a cliff, surrounded by neighbors, with no pipes, no plumbing, and no private rooms, where would you go? Because the answer doesn't just reveal where they relieved themselves. It reveals how they lived, how they adapted, and how deeply human they truly were.